Test your own human rights. Some people in our society and still do only believe that the rights that we should be writing in a Bill of Rights are the rights for me, not for you. But that's the real test when I stand up for you, despite the fact that you might be ideologically very different from me.
Good evening. I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. We can get through this, navigating a divided country in a time of great uncertainty. How do Americans navigate an election with so much at stake, including the very future of democracy? Half the Americans' country will view the outcome of this election as an existential threat to their identities, values, and concept of what it is to be an American. How do we stay true to our values while keeping our country together no matter what is the outcome? How do we build and maintain relationships of respect and dignity anchored in democratic values and norms? I'm delighted to welcome three internationally recognized thought leaders to this evening's program who will tackle these and other pressing questions and concerns about the state of our democracy on the eve of one of the most consequential elections of our times. We are joined by Monica McWilliams, founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and a key negotiator in the Northern Ireland peace process. Donna Hicks of the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University and the author of the acclaimed book, Leading with Dignity: How to Create a Culture that Brings Out the Best in People, and our evening's moderator, Tim Phillips, founder of and CEO of Beyond Conflict. Tim, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the Ford Hall Forum podium. This is your third time with us. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. And I want to thank the Ford Hall Forum, WGBH, and Suffolk University. I'm also a proud graduate of Suffolk University. And to my great surprise, they gave me an honorary degree a few years ago. So it's really wonderful to be back here. And just to sort of frame this conversation, you mentioned a bit about Beyond Conflict. So Beyond Conflict is a Boston-based international nonprofit that for the last 35 years has worked around the world using this model of shared lived experience, meaning we would bring to the table people like Monica or Donna or other folks who lived in countries that never imagined they could sit across the table from their enemy, that they could advance peace or be an agent of change themselves. And the first time I met Monica in 1994 in Belfast, it was before the peace process formally began. And it was when Monica attended a conference that we did in Belfast about the future of peace in Northern Ireland. And what we did was bring in leaders from South Africa, the Middle East at the time, the Oslo peace process, El Salvador, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. People who sat across profound divides and negotiated the end of apartheid or peace agreements elsewhere, who themselves at one point never imagined they could do this. And I remember there was this moment in Belfast when Rolf Meyer, who had been the key negotiator for the apartheid government in the talks to end apartheid, looked out into the audience and said to everybody, and particularly to the women, don't rely on these men to represent you. And, you know, what we have found over time is that these folks who have been through it have so much to share, so much wisdom to pass on, but also recognize the opportunities and limitations. And that's just one example of this sort of approach. And then about 12 years ago, around 13 years ago, around the Arab Spring, I was working in places like Bahrain and elsewhere in the Middle East. And I would bring in people like Monica or Rolf or others from these different countries to share their experience with people in, for example, Bahrain, who are struggling to build a more democratic society. And, you know, my friends would say to me, you know, after we did the work at the end of the evening, you know, you need to focus back in your own country. They could sense the troubles that have emerged in the United States long before I could ever do. Like sort of canaries in a coal mine, they knew how language, how attitude, how perceptions were shaping a deepening us versus them mindset in the United States, coming from where they came from. And I recognized we had profound problems, but I never really fully recognized how bad they were until really the last 8 or 9 years. And so we've been bringing in this model of shared lived experience to the United States across the country and trying to model for Americans, as bad as things may be or could be, that there is a way forward, that others have been through similarly difficult and in many cases more violent conflicts or lived under dictatorship for a long period of time. And when things hit rock bottom, they found a way forward. And so we're at this existential, really sort of mind-numbing moment as Americans. And the question is, not only how do we get through this, but we know we can get through this. And so as maybe a contribution to this moment we're all in, is to have a conversation with Monica and Donna. And let me just say about Monica, not only was she the founder or co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, it became the first global political party, and not representing globally, but model of women being involved in politics that had never existed before. And what Monica experienced as a negotiator was quite profound. And Monica will talk to it. And there's so much. And I remember at one point when Monica and Rolf and others were in the United States, we were meeting with some senior members of Congress last year. And they kept on using the word compromise. And Monica remembers, she said, there's nothing wrong with compromise. But where I came from, just using that word led to people pulling back and contracting across the divide. And what we found was the word accommodate brought people in at the negotiating table. So just the reframing in a deeply divided society is so critical. And so we're at that moment here in the United States. So Monica has, I think, a lot for us to learn from as somebody who came from an activist background, as a civil rights campaigner, working on women's issues and gender issues, to being a leader of a political party that sat across the table with her enemies and advanced meaningful change. And Donna Hicks and I have known each other, as I am with Monica, for close to 3 decades, and worked in Sri Lanka and the Balkans and other countries, trying to navigate through conflict to peace. And I remember early on, Donna would say to me, with her training in social psychology, about the role of emotions, or passions, as it would be called, that unless we understand violations to people's dignity and what the experience of humiliation and exclusion does to folks, we will never really be able to advance or help advance meaningful change. And Donna's book, Dignity, and their more recent one, Leading with Dignity, has been really a global bestseller, because it really situates this in a really profound and necessary way. So I want to start this conversation with Monica. And Monica, as the title of this session reads, not only we can get through this, but it's prefaced on or related to the thought, how do we get through this? And one question I want to start with is, how do we navigate this moment we're in as Americans while keeping our country intact?
The first thing, Tim, I would say is I've been here before, not in terms of American politics, but in terms of 30 years of conflict coming to an end, and worrying about how we would make the transition after the peace agreement, how we would get over the line to get people to say yes, that what we did was the right thing. And we had people on the other side who were known as the anti-agreement. So there was pro-agreement versus the anti-agreement. And we were very concerned that first we needed them to say yes. So we actually did what you're doing here in the United States, was we took to the streets. We had an open air double-decker bus and filled it with our kids and women, and we went from village to village. And I have to say, it was quite difficult, given the things that we were called, the name calling. People would poke at me with a stick, pretending it was a gun. There was a real kind of tense atmosphere, and we were concerned that some of the people who had signed the agreement, who were challenging their own side, which is really what leadership is about, would end up dead because of the things that were being said. We were selling out. It's easy in 2 seconds to tell somebody they're selling out. It's much more complicated to give the reasons why you're not doing that. It's easy to say no. It's much more complicated to explain the reasons. Yes, I say all that because I know what hate looked like. I know what violence of the tongue, when it leads to violence of the gun, looked like. And I'm saying this now, that I have never been so shocked as I am today, having heard what was said yesterday at Madison Square Gardens. It was pure hate speech. And it shouldn't be normalized. It wouldn't happen actually today in the United Kingdom because we have laws against that. And it's not funny, and it's not right that comedians, make racist comments and say it is some kind of joke. We've known what it's like when women have been on the receiving end and the brunt of pubs jokes. And we've kind of stopped that. But to stand on a stage and say the things that were said, I am very shocked, and it's very toxic. So I take some heart from what Seamus Heaney wrote, the poet who taught here in Boston, in Harvard. He was a neighbor of ours. His father and my father were cattle dealers together. And he wrote a poem based on the Curate Troy, the Greek play. And what he was really addressing was the questions of personal morality and deceit and political expediency and suffering. And I knew the people he was referring to. He refers to the hunger striker who died for the cause. And he refers to the widow who had to bury her police officer husband after she'd given birth. And they were our neighbors. And they turned on each other. And at the start of that poem, he writes, human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. And what I see here is a very unkind type of politics. Now, I always know that elections drive people to the extremes of the continuum. And it's very hard to bring people back in to use more moderate language. So I am concerned about the day after. And I do think that he was right to say that when you come through a period that you're coming through at the minute, you have extreme anxiety. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. What I saw last night and what I've seen here in the last 2 weeks that I've been in the United States is a form of moral injury through language and behavior. And what I'm worrying about is what I hear today is that some of the post boxes where ballots are being posted are being firebombed. So you're already beginning to see the tasting what some of this violence might look like. So prepare. And perhaps this conversation will lead us to discussing how we prepared for the day after and how not to send people further into the cold, because that just breeds insecurity and breeds more exclusion. So clearly, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of creating a more inclusive society.
Thank you, Monica. I mean, to what you and many others were saying over a decade ago, we're now at this point in the United States. And what you said about this language and how it normalizes violence and how it can normalize further violence really sits on our human psychology in a way that is really deeply troubling. And I want to go to you, Donna, if you don't mind. You've done a lot of work in peace processes where you saw the role of hate and fear and insecurity and stereotype can play to drive us further apart. But what anchored everybody is when they felt their dignity was being violated. So that's happening right now in this country, and not just on the left or the right, across many spectrums, even among communities who are not political. So what could you say to this moment based also on what Monica just shared?
Thank you, Tim. And I think that one of the major issues that we're facing now in terms of what we think is acceptable to actually speak and say, as Monica was saying, the words hurt, and there's no question about that. What I have found is that, as you pointed out earlier, my work all focuses on how to restore the dignity that has been grossly violated in times of conflict. And as you also pointed out, I've been working all over the world on this issue, in the Middle East, in Sri Lanka, in Colombia, at so many different places, Greece, Turkey, that conflict as well. And what I've concluded after listening to the stories of the people about how, you know, they were pounding their fist on the table and saying, this is injustice, this is horrible, this is not fair. But then at one point, I remember saying to the group that I was working with, you know what, I think this is about your dignity. I think this is about your feeling like you haven't even been treated as a human being. And I would say to them, look, I think before we go any farther talking about the political issues that we can't, you know, come to an agreement on, I think we need to talk about the ways in which you feel your dignity has been assaulted in this conflict. Because once we understand what I've come to know as the human dimension of these conflicts, powerfully displayed right here in this country, as Monica pointed out, there are stories underneath that rage and that vitriol and that ugly, you know, racism. And not to say that they're justified, but all I'm saying is there are stories on both sides of these divides here in this country. And my experience has been that when people have an opportunity to talk about those stories, and I'm not even, you know, going to let's solve the problem yet. I'm just wanting to understand what people have been through that have led them to this decision to be violent, to be, you know, hurtful, and to create these moral injuries, as Monica said. Because here's the most important thing that I share with people before we engage in these discussions about their dignity violations. I share with them something you know very well, Tim, and that is that dignity isn't just about being nice to people. You know, okay, I'm going to be nice. No, dignity has a profound effect on our psychological well-being, as you just pointed out. And what happens is that when somebody experiences a dignity violation, it shows up in the brain in the same area as if the person experienced a physical injury. Now think about that for a minute. The brain doesn't know the difference between a wound to its dignity and a physical injury. So, you know, I mean, is it any wonder that when people don't feel seen, don't feel heard, feel their identity is not recognized, not treated fairly, you know, not included and not acknowledged for what they've been through? Is there any wonder why people get outraged? And you take a leader, you get a leader who knows how to tap into those wounds, into that negativity, like, you know, like we're experiencing here. And it is very, very frightening what people will do, because indignity brings out the worst in us humans. There's all kinds of research about this. And the flip side is equally true, that dignity actually brings out the best in us. When we feel like we're treated with dignity, our dignity is recognized and acknowledged. So this is the question. What do we want to do? Do we want to promote more indignity, or do we want to create spaces for people to have these discussions about their dignity? And Tim, this is a very long-term problem. I'm not suggesting that, you know, everybody learns about dignity and then, okay, you know, it's kumbaya. But it is the first step, the education about what the consequences are when we continue to verbally abuse people, when we violate their dignity. It's turning us into a nation that I don't even recognize anymore. So if indignity tears us apart, dignity can put us back together again.
Thank you, Donna. And I want to go to you, Monica, but I want to, you know, and I can speak for myself, is when so many values, sort of core values, are being attacked, you know, and not just like, this isn't just a contest between, let's say, a liberal or conservative view. but about the very nature of the society and the social contract, right? And what we were brought to believe in our democracy, as imperfect as it is, that it's based on a certain set of values at the core when it's best lived. And we're now seeing potentially half the country vote against that. So there's a deep sense of betrayal about others, saying, do they not share this foundational set of principles and values? And I'm not talking about political views. I'm talking about basics of decency, character, integrity, treating others with respect, recognizing that we may not have as much in common, but if you recognize what we do have in common is to be seen and treated with that respect, dignity. And so how do you, if on the other side of this election, we see Donald Trump elected, and if he lives up to everything he's threatening, as we saw yesterday and elsewhere, how do you navigate that? I mean, you were under a lot of pressure when you formed the Women's Coalition, we're at the negotiating table. I mean, you sat next to somebody who led a paramilitary group that killed a boyfriend in college. And not only was that personally difficult, and you're talking about a profound wound, but you were under tremendous pressure from within your broader community. Like, how can we do that? Can you just speak to that experience?
Well, it's not for everyone. And I'm not sure that everyone in Northern Ireland is in a place where they can reach out and speak because they've been so badly hurt. But I'm not so sure about how we get to that situation of dignity when you don't understand, if you don't think there's an equivalency of hurt. And in our situation, that was the perception of loss that was creating a real problem for us in terms of those who wished to vote against the agreement. And perception can become reality. And if they had a sense of entitlements, which the agreement obviously challenged and found a different way through in terms of fairness and equality and human rights, and making reforms that created a more stable and indeed today a more prosperous society, they didn't believe that. Because they believed that there was nothing wrong with the things that they were seeing. They had normalized this entitlement, this sense that I don't know that the word supremacy helps, because they wouldn't see themselves as supremacists and don't like it in the UK and in Ireland. We try not to call them far right, because many of them see themselves not as far right. They think they're right rather than far right. So it is about that set of values. And so how do you engage in a conversation about equality and fairness when one side doesn't even believe that the other side's entitled to any of that, or that they're losing everything? You can't take the candy from the baby without the baby screaming. And so it really was about how did we engage in conversations. It was reframing it. They had a narrative and other people had a different narrative, even about the causes of the conflict. We're still arguing 25 years later after signing the agreement. So sometimes you don't get into that. You actually get into the chemistry of the people that you can engage with on the other side. Reach out at the worst moments to someone. It's all I can give is practical examples. We formed a coalition. It was diverse, it was pluralist. I was a wiser person as a result of listening to someone on the other side who would say to me, this is how I saw it. He was a leader, actually, of one of those paramilitary groups, spent many years in prison, came out a changed person. And because he had a past, he said it didn't mean he couldn't have a future. And I believed in that. I believed people can change. And he was the one I built the closest relationship, even though we were ideologically very, very different. And through listening to him, I became much wiser. People would say because I was a professor that I might have been a clever person, but I wasn't necessarily a wiser person. And therefore, I think it's really important, as Rolf would tell you in South Africa, reaching out to members of the ANC when he came from the majority party, and do it at the moment of the crisis and prepare for it long before you reach a turning point. You don't want people to go to the precipice, to the edge of the cliff, and look over and see this is not where we should be. So we started really preparing for that. Today, all these years later, I'm really glad to say that some of the people who told me to shut up and sit down, and hence the reason why I called the book Stand Up, Speak Out, because I decided it was time to do the opposite and not to be humiliated. It also said more about them and their bad behavior and how they were bonding in this really bad behavior towards us. We were simply confusing because we refused to be put into binaries of you're either British or Irish, you're either Protestant or Catholic, you're either for the union or for something different, the unification. People are not all on one extreme or the other. And we were saying there are other ways to come through this. So inclusion, equality, and human rights were the three principles, and we tested ourselves by those every day. So really, it's about building relationships, finding the chemistry of the leaders on the other side, and there has to be people on, and I've seen it. I mean, Liz Cheney, for instance, came from one particular part of that political divide and now speaks with a different view, having looked down from the balcony. And when you get people like that, those are the people that also need support. And so today we have, as I said, formed a group. We call ourselves a group of elders. We were all the political leaders at the time. And some of those now are the people who didn't agree with the agreement. And we're still working. And what we're working on is today, when we meet every 3 months, is to say to each other, I see it like this, how do you see it? Okay, if your folk are seeing it like this, then let us see if we can go back to our own areas of influence and use this lens to try and move the political situation further, that creates stability, that doesn't create instability to the point where we go back again to what we did to each other 30 years before.
Well, thank you, Monica. You know, I just want to build off of the key points you were saying, and get to one about leadership in a moment. But about, you use the word chemistry, right? But it's about what is that personal human connection? And the person you talked about, I believe, was David Irvine, who I had a great pleasure of knowing. And he said to me one time that as a Protestant loyalist, a loyalist is, for the audience, were those mostly working class Protestants who saw themselves as loyal defenders of the union with the United Kingdom. And many of them resorted to violence, either because they felt it was the best defense or they were manipulated into that in one form or another. But the bottom line is many of them resorted to violence. And David spent a decade in prison for those activities. And he once said to me, you know, Tim, I came to realize, and he mentioned you, Monica, by getting to know Monica McWilliams, you know, it challenged my own assumptions about the other side, not only about who they were, but how they thought about me. And he told me once that he resorted to joining one of the paramilitary groups when a young man of the same name, David Irvine, same age, was killed by an IRA bomb. He didn't know him, but he's so outraged thinking that could have been me that he said the best defense was a good offense. And then several years into prison and seeing the suffering, he said, I came to realize that we were killing to live. And then we got to a point that we were living to kill. And this had to change. And he said, what held me later in the peace process, I don't know if I ever shared this with you, Monica. He said, Monica restored my dignity. She gave me respect. And I just thought of this, it's been several years since related to what Donna was saying. And he also said to some people when we went to Kosovo, and they were screaming and yelling, saying, what do you as a terrorist know about any of this material, any of this experience? And he said, you know, terrorists have to come from somewhere. And humiliation and indignity is a powerful place to come from. And this wasn't a soft, let's everybody get into a circle. He was at one time a hardcore leader of a paramilitary group. But that chemistry you talked about bonded because each side recognized that they brought fear, stereotypes into this process. And then on that, what you called chemistry level, that human level, was somebody just in that engagement restores a sense of dignity and strips some of the shame away, right, Donna? And I think that's so important. And the question is, how do we do this on the other side of this election, no matter what happens? One side result will be much more challenging, while recognizing, you said, Monica, the imbalances of injustice.
Yeah. Thank you, Tim. I didn't know that he'd said that about my relationship with him. Actually, I should also, not everybody would know this. That was very difficult when people saw the relationship that we were building. And in a country where there are not many women in public life, what do they say? Oh, she must be having an affair with him.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing you had to knock down to stop the rumors and the lies, because you were prepared to stand up for him and him for me. But they didn't like that. And so that was quite challenging and quite humiliating at times. But I used to say this, remind myself all the time when they were coming at me from different directions. This is more about them than it is about me. And if they are actually using some really bad insults, it actually goes against them in the end. And be interested to see how much of last night actually works out in terms of votes changing. Because, you know, people have to ask themselves at the end of the day, is that the kind of language I want to hear in my society every day?
Right.
That's not really transformative.
Yeah.
And it's very worrying. So yeah, I'm glad you said that. And that's what helped us to reach an agreement, a peace agreement. But you don't always have leaders like that. You have to build them. And when President Mandela said to us in South Africa, when we were saying, oh, we don't have leaders like you, go home and grow them. So I think that's really sensible. And there are leaders in our community, in your community, the minute I see them. So that, I think we should be preparing for that good leadership on the day after. So
Yeah.
that you prepare to get yourself through this. This is a really difficult time for America. It's a difficult time for us in Europe watching it, because so much of our own conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East and even in Ireland with Brexit all depended on the United States involvement. So we're watching this very carefully and really hoping that you come through the other side of this. So much depends on it, both in your locality, but also in your nation and also in other nations. Because that language that's being used at the minute, that toxicity, I never thought you would be inviting me to come to the United States of America to talk about how we could cross the aisles and talk to each other, when you spent your life coming to us to try and engage with us and in other countries about getting people engaged with each other across the aisles. Polarization is pretty toxic here at the minute. And, you know, I think we really have to think about how to get back to the values that built a stable and prosperous democracy.
Thank you, Monica. You know, Donna, I remember in Colombia, where you had gone early on, there was a first woman defense minister of Colombia. And this is before the peace agreement, Monica. And I remember you telling me that she felt, she knew you from her fellowship at Harvard, that it was tough being a first woman defense minister with all these big generals in the midst of a war. And you went down there with actually, Monica, our friend Jose Maria, and several years ago. And if you could tell the story, because when you found that the breakthrough happened when all these 3- and 4-star generals were asked about their dignity violations, right? Can you just share that briefly?
It was quite a moment in my career, because I had decided that I was going to try to address the conflict there between our friend, who was the woman first defense minister, and the rest of the administration, especially the military. And so they had asked me to do a communication skills workshop, because the defense ministry and the military, they're having a miserable time. They had a terrible conflict. It was getting in the media. It was ugly. There was this, you know, sort of sexist dimension to it, as you pointed out with the woman who was the defense minister. Anyway, it was a really real marker in my approach to these conflicts, because I decided I'm not going to do a communication skills workshop. I am, for the first time, going to ask people to talk about times in which they felt their dignity had been violated by the conflict. And it was so interesting because, you know, first of all, they were looking at me, this Harvard professor, what's she doing here, trying to tell us what to do? And Chema, our friend Jose Maria Argueta, was with me during this whole project. And So the generals wouldn't even look at me when we started. But then we presented the dignity model. Even before we started talking about anything, I decided that they needed to be educated about what the power of dignity and the power of indignity. And so I, presented all of this, the basic building blocks of dignity, and they finally decided, okay, yeah, we want to talk about times in which we felt our dignity had been assaulted by this conflict. And there was something, Monica talks about the chemistry there. Once people genuinely start talking about what their experiences are, the empathy that goes flying out of the window when you have a conflict with someone, when you hear that person talk about the pain and suffering they'd experienced in that toxic relationship, something happens, that empathy is restored. And that's, Monica, I think that's where the chemistry starts, because you start listening. You mentioned the word listening. And it's not just listening for the words. It's listening for the experience of what it was like to have their dignity, trampled on. And something magical happens when you create that space for people on both sides of the divide to be able to share what it was like, what that suffering was like. And honestly, there were times when there wasn't a dry eye in the house. And, one of these generals at the end, one of the guys who was kind of rolling his eyes when he, saying, what is she doing here? What's she going to do for us? At the end of 2 days, working with these high-level officials, the general who was rolling his eyes at me came over to me and shook my hand and said, Donna, I really have to shake your hand, because not only did you help us repair the relationship here in the room with your dignity model, but he said, I think you saved my marriage. So he's thinking, oh my gosh, if this is what it looks like to violate dignity, I think I must be violating my wife's dignity all the time. And I've got to go and ask for forgiveness. So, this isn't just about these kind of conflicts that Monica and the three of us have all been involved in. This is about everybody. Nobody wants to have their dignity assaulted. Nobody wants that. And if we could create opportunities here in this country where people can be heard, they can tell their stories and be acknowledged and recognized for the suffering that they've endured. That is a long way. That's a long way to bridging these divides. I don't say, believe me, I'm not telling you that this is the panacea and the cure-all. It's not, but it's a start. It's beginning to have a deeper understanding, which is one of the elements of dignity, to try to seek deeper understanding of what the other side has been through and what their, like you always say, Tim, what their lived experience has been. Whenever I've done that here in this country, just going to a person who you feel very, opposed to in terms of the policy and the behavior, and go to them and say, hey, look, I really would like to understand more about how you've come to the conclusion that you have in your political leanings. Please, I really want to know, because I have a feeling I've had a very different experience, and I want to open my mind. I want to hear what you went through in your life or in your adulthood. What did you go through that made you decide that you wanted to choose X or Y, whichever party?
Right.
So it's that, Monica talks about the chemistry, but you can't get that chemistry unless you see that other as a human being, and that we share that humanity. We share that pain when our dignity's been violated. I think that our aspiration and our yearning to be treated with dignity is our highest common denominator as humans. And if we can get to that notion that when we look at another person, even if we disagree, that we can see that dignity in their eyes, and it will be reflected back in the way they treat us too. So it's, I always say we talk about trying to find common ground in our business, right? In the conflict resolution world. I think we need higher ground. I think we need to elevate our own consciousness and the consciousness of others to see each other as shared humanity. I mean, you talk about shared experiences. I say that those shared experiences will lead us to a shared understanding of what it means to be human. And that's what can unify us, that shared understanding of what it means to have dignity.
Thank you, Donna. I want to go to Monica, and then we're going to go to questions. And that is, so a couple of things. One is, whatever happens on the other side of this election, we're going to live in a deeply divided country. And if Donald Trump should win, it's going to be a very different country where I think a lot of people are going to feel compelled, and not traditional activists, to organize, to resist, and to build coalitions. And my question is, how do we do this and build coalitions, and what does that look like across difference, but don't fall into the binaries that exist today on the left and the right, that we can't engage with others. They weren't there with us. They don't quite understand our history. Where were they in the past? How do you navigate this at this moment?
You know, we'd said enough is enough. We can't go on living like this. There were political parties around, but most of them all of them represented one side or the other. And we said, listen, you know, everybody thought the other was untouchable. And so I found the coalition was a safer place to be. Even getting my own views challenged was really useful. And as a result, well, we've been doing this for years, for heaven's sake. Well, that's what women do on the front lines. That's what we've been doing at the interfaces and on the peace lines, crossing over. And transition means crossing over, going from where you are to the other side. And that's how we kept people safe, and geographically, physically, but also in our coalition. But it takes time, and it takes longer to get to a decision, to get to consensus. And it doesn't mean consensus is built on the lowest common denominator. It means that you listen to all the various views. And in the end, we came up with the idea that they used elsewhere in South Africa: sufficiency of consensus. You don't wait around for a unanimous vote. You don't allow the majority to dictate to the minority, but you have a good diversity of opinion in that room. And the question I always asked was, after this meeting tonight, will you feel safe going home with the decision we've just made? Because I'm going public tomorrow, saying this is what we now believe needs to be done. Will you be able to still live in your community? Will you get your windows broken? Will you get put out of your house? And those safety questions were foremost to our minds as well. But some did live very precarious lives as we took each step. But eventually at those meetings, we got to decisions, and we went to the press and constantly said, this behavior is not acceptable. It shouldn't be normalized. Here's what we think, and this should be what should happen. Sometimes, Tim, you also have to set up monitoring bodies. Where it's really got out of hand, you got to monitor it. So we had mediators as well as negotiators, and we set up mediation networks. And on the streets, we sent people out to mediate the protests. And then eventually we established a commission with guidelines that if you promise to do this at the next protest, you better stick to it. Otherwise, there's penalties for bad behavior. You know, there's carrots and sticks all the time. You talk about the open hand or the fist. And I think that's what we did. Oversight. I'm now an oversight commissioner. Believe it or not, for some of the armed groups that still are existing in paramilitaries. And that's about keeping those young people out of jail. I mean, what happened after January 6th? It was the people who got caught, who got sent to prison, not the people who were calling them out to do certain actions. Now, we had this expression, you polish the bullet, but you get someone else to fire it. And it's always the young, in our case, who were listening to this rhetoric, who ended up in jails. Now, that's no place to build the next generation. So there's a different way of coming at this. And So you do stand up, you speak out, you call it out, but you do show that there is a different way. And when people could see that we were in a coalition of diversity and building on, as I said, test your own human rights. Some people in our society, and still do, only believe that the rights that we should be writing in a Bill of Rights are the rights for me, not for you. But that's the real test, when I stand up for you, despite the fact that you might be ideologically very different from me.
You said earlier that about Liz Cheney as an example of somebody who was, for a lot of Americans have political views they would never, ever imagine or countenance or think they had anything in common with. But you look at Jamie Raskin or Liz Cheney have become really good friends, but neither one of them have surrendered their political values. And what I've learned from Northern Ireland, South Africa, and other countries, once leaders across these profound divides were committed to a process of change, in your case, ending a war, in the case of South Africa, building a multiracial democracy anchored in the rule of law, they needed each other because they were under immense pressure on both sides. And what they found in that process of engagement is that you had allies who shared foundational values.
Yeah.
And I wonder if in this moment, because of how polarizing, how unbelievably toxic language is, how could you imagine having anything in common with the other side? And I think what I'm hearing from you is, don't see the other side as monolithic.
Yeah.
Right? See the other side as having people who can be the allies who share those values, but you may not know it and they may not know that about you.
Yeah. I mean, South Africa taught me a lot those 3 days that we went and got locked up in a military camp with the different people who had negotiated the transition. And, I watched it. I also, when I was tasked with drafting the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, I learned that in South Africa, it was called the Bill for Whites, because the minority thought that the bill that they were going to give was going to give so many rights to the people that were supremacists towards them. But it's actually a Bill of Human Rights universally for all. So what does that teach me? That we're interdependent, that we're like the stripes of the zebra. If there's a black stripe and a white stripe, the zebra, shows that it's dependent on both. So I love my life when I think of myself as interdependent on my neighbors, the people that I may not agree with ideologically, but who I have to live alongside. And in fact, one of the women in the coalition said, when she was criticized she was coming to meetings with me, we always did it in twos, and sometimes she was challenged. And her husband said, you're not asked to be in love with them. You're not even asked maybe to like them, but you're asked to work with them. And, in your own workplace, that's how you do it. And then sometimes in your workplace, you're shocked by how much you actually can find out about the other person and the humanity in the other person. In our case, it was even more about the legitimacy of the other person, of the other side, because you started this conversation about terrorists, and people did not believe those people who had a past could have any legitimacy. When you have a mandate and when the people elect you, you have a legitimacy, and that's what you're going to be facing. So that's where I came in and said, once you have a legitimacy, then you must, but also your elections must be fair and free. And I worry that the United States doesn't have an independent, trusted institution federally that oversees these elections. You need to trust your judiciary, you need to trust your executive, and you need to trust the person that's leading your country. And those institutions must be set up very strongly after this election, where no matter how much you are challenged, that they come out the other side. And I worry about the way those institutions, the United States of America, have been changed. So you do have concerns here, but we did have them too. And as Seamus Heaney said, we had a sea change. And we did come out the other side, and I do believe the United States will come out the other side.
As they say, from your lips to God's ears, but I believe you. I have a question for both of you. One question that's coming through is, and I'm recapping is, and this is for both of you, how do you navigate with dignity while fighting, while the other side is fighting against your democracy, against a basic sense of right and wrong, against integrity? For many, it feels like it's a battle between good versus evil. Or what if the other person in power is a sociopath who cannot be reached through dignity, kindness, empathy? And I want to go to both of you, but I want to start, if you don't mind, with you, Monica, because you've dealt with this directly. And I think it's the moment Americans are in, right? Which is, we're being asked, and I say we, those who in this case don't support, to sort of look the other way, or to hope that people will change. But if I take away something from global experience, it's, yes, there are leaders who can shape a community in highly destructive ways, but they're a way to reach others around them, right? To break through. And I wonder if that's one of the core lessons for this moment, that what we're not talking about, as somebody said, kumbaya, but it's actually rooted in real experience.
Yeah. And, I got called a Pollyanna at times. I was too much of an idealist, but it wasn't. It turned out that we weren't. And yes, we had the sociopaths, and you need to figure them out, because you're not going to convince those. And every society has them. So figure out, who is it on the other side that I can talk to and reach out. Sometimes you really would like to have a critical mass, but sometimes it begins with one or two.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And we crossed over. And, some of the people at the table took a longer time to accept that we're there in friendship and not there as spies.
Yeah.
You can have all kinds of worries that you're an agent for the other side. Just forget that. The stakes are higher. Forget what they're calling you. Forget the names, even though you go home and have a shower and try to wash the vitriol off you, as I did every Friday night after I came home from those big forums. Not always from the peace table, because it was smaller. But even there, the behavior and the language wasn't great. But then it slowly began to change. And you may not believe that the person's listening at times. Sometimes you have to write it down. Sometimes you have to make it in a way, or get an intermediary to pass on the message. Communicate at the most difficult times to someone who you can identify with as a person that can get the message right across that particular party. And that's what we did. And it worked.
I just want to draw together, piece together what you had said earlier about the shared values, and when there's no shared values, how difficult. I mean, even democracy isn't shared here now anymore. But what I have found when I've been the most successful doing these dignity interventions with parties in conflict is that we may not get them to agree politically on different aspects of the settlement, or how they would ever even compromise. You mentioned that earlier. But what I have been able to do with them is that they both agree that dignity is something that is really, really important to both of them. And the shared platform that they articulate to each other is, yes, we can work with you if you do agree that my dignity is just as important as yours, and that we can build on that foundation. I mean, that's what happened in so many of these interventions that I did. Once they learn about dignity, and by the way, sometimes I spend a whole day talking about what dignity is and what dignity isn't, because it's not respect. It's very different from respect, because in my mind, dignity is our inherent value and worth as human beings, but respect is something that's earned. And when you make this distinction, a friend of mine who did an intervention recently, she said, when I told people that they didn't have to respect each other, but they had to treat each other with dignity, they felt freed up. Like, You're not going to ask me to respect somebody who's, you know, done horrible things to me. But if I want to bring an end to this conflict, I have to share that platform, which is a basic agreement that dignity is important and that my dignity is equally as important as yours. Once we can elevate that platform to a point where that becomes their shared value, I'm telling you, it is almost like magic what happens when they both agree. I don't want to have to respect somebody, but I can treat them with dignity as if they, you know, because we share that human
I
being.
think what Donna's saying, Donna's using the word platform, but I would take it from an abstract platform to a real platform. I think your media needs to have more platforms where people are having those conversations across and with their differences.
Great idea.
Because if you just have the one platform selling a menu, you're just going to internalize that menu and repeat it and repeat it. Whereas if you get an exchange after this election with different kinds of platforms in your media and your communities, that's what we did. As soon as we got the agreement, we had to go out and sell it to the people. We wanted to get it over the line, and we started setting up these platforms with our diversity of views, saying, this is why I think we need to ask the people to come with us on this. And so, you know, if I had just been talking to my friends, there wasn't much point. So you did need to have a difference of opinion, but treating each other in a way, I would use the word respect, because I don't see much of that happening at the minute. And you have some ground rules where you do agree to share those platforms, and good moderators. And that can be in your own community, but it can also be on those bigger platforms, because those are the messages people are going to hear the day after this election when the polls are finally counted, no matter which way it goes. I think people want and are thirsting here to hear people coming together to say, right, this is what we're going to do for the sake of our country.
Unfortunately, we didn't have time to do all of these questions and about the role of the media and, you know, how do people find a way to accommodate the other. But I can share as an American that over the last several years, I realized how difficult this work is. That I had, and I probably speak for Donna, when I was in Northern Ireland, South Africa, Bosnia, and many other places, where I would encourage people to sit down at the table, not just with their quote unquote enemies, but people who did horrendous things and said the most toxic things. And the pain that many of these people brought to the table, who were the victims of a lot of this behavior over time, to encourage them, like I did once in Bosnia, for Muslim Bosnian families to go back to Srebrenica. After the election in 2016, I found it difficult sometimes to talk with people who I knew who voted for the other side. And I came to realize, if this is difficult for me, what is it like for people like Monica and many others around the world who hit rock bottom and ask themselves, not only there has to be a better way, but how do we approach this differently? And there's going to be a lot of difficulty, you know, in this process. And so a lot of the questions I see are questions that I often had and others have had, and I've been doing this for 35 years. And it just, you know, we're at that point as Americans that we have to recognize that not everybody on the other side is your enemy or our enemy. And I'm saying on both sides. And that leaders who shape a narrative don't always fundamentally speak for that community. It's just that the community is often afraid to speak out. And norms and behavior and language is important. And recognizing people's dignity is recognizing when people feel marginalized, excluded, or humiliated. These are powerful emotions. Right. So this won't be the last of important conversations I think we need to have in the United States, no matter what happens on the other side of this election, because we will continue to find ourselves deeply divided and divided over core values and principles. But like what we said about Liz Cheney and Jamie Raskin as an example, or like Monica, you said it, you and David Irvine, you don't have to surrender your political views. And people may have said things and say things that you find offensive, but do you share some core foundational values that are about ending war, building peace and justice, anchored in dignity, and building a society that's anchored in the rule of law? And there's no other alternative but to find a way to do that. So thank you.
Tim, Monica, and Donna, thank you so very, very much for joining us. Thank you for your thoughts. And most importantly, thank you to our audience for joining us for this conversation. And go out and vote.